Tell us about this statement, this very bold and strong statement from Mike Pompeo now, saying that the Americans actually believe that this virus is traced to that Institute of Virology, to the lab in Wuhan, rather than the wet market.
It is a very interesting statement from Secretary Pompeo, but I'm not privy to the intelligence he reads, so we can only talk about this from an Australian perspective. And I think all it does is really validate the Prime Minister's call for an independent inquiry. And I think it's the right call. And it also validates the Prime Minister's move to build a coalition of nations who also want the inquiry to go ahead. We can't rule anything in, we can't rule anything out, and that's why we've got to have this independent inquiry.
Well, given that Mike Pompeo has said this, and given we have the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement, Australia would expect to see that intelligence, wouldn't it?
I suppose so, but again, Chris, I'm over here in Mandurah, Perth. I haven't been back to Canberra for some time, performing the functions of the committee, but certainly because of the Five Eye sharing arrangements, I'm sure that would be taking place. But all we can do is look at it from our perspective in the open source environment, and I think this again validates the Prime Minister's call for an independent inquiry. That way we can get to the bottom of the origins of the virus and the spread of the virus. One thing is for certain is that it did originate in Wuhan, as the Prime Minister has said, and that's our starting point. Everything else is up for conjecture at this stage.
You know, regardless of specifically what has led to this intelligence, whether it's human intelligence or interceptions, photographic, whatever it is, it will inflame China, won't it? The fact that Mike Pompeo has said this is going to further inflame relations between Washington and Beijing.
What we've seen over the last several years, Chris, is increased competition between the People's Republic of China and the United States. This will certainly increase the tension, but one thing we need to do more of is cooperate. And I think an independent inquiry with US cooperation, with the Chinese government's cooperation, would be a good thing for us all. It would take the heat out of this conversation, and we could get down to the facts. Where did this start? How did it start? How did it spread? And then from that, we could build the necessary global health architecture so that in future pandemics, because if history is our guide, it will happen again at some time, we'll all be better prepared for it, and we can prevent the loss of life and also the economic damage which many countries, including ours, have sustained during this time.
Well, indeed, if China has any problems with the claim being made by the US now, there's an easy way to fix it, and that is to have an international independent investigation headed up by the World Health Organization.
Certainly, and I would be looking for a fresh set of eyes at the World Health Organization. I know that's a view shared by many on the backbench. I think the World Health Organization has not done a great job of handling this pandemic. So with a change of leadership and some fresh eyes, I think they'd be well placed to lead an independent inquiry.
Yeah, I think they need a new boss. There's a lot of merit in that argument. Now, I've seen a newsletter you've sent out to your constituents. You talk about the face of authoritarian political warfare coming from China in this public debate in Australia. You talk about how China expects us to toe the line, and you say that we're on the road to serfdom in a new world order if we do kowtow to China in this way. These are strong words. What is it about the authoritarian political warfare we are experiencing in this country from China?
It's a good question, Chris. What I was trying to do last week was summarise for my constituents what they'd seen unfold over a 5-day period. On Monday, they had the PRC ambassador threatening economic coercion. On Tuesday, they saw a disinformation campaign where the contents of a discussion between our head of DFAT and the ambassador was published online, an incorrect version of events. And then on Wednesday, we saw them conduct a media stunt. So the way I saw it was that it was 3 different modes of political warfare. And I was making the point to my constituents that in a world like the world that we're in right now, we need to maintain our sovereignty, and that involves having transparency in the public square. That's why a free press is very important. That's why some of the legislative architecture that we've introduced over the last few years, the espionage and foreign interference legislation, for example, is so important. And we also need to be resilient. We can't just get pushed around when someone threatens to break the economic relationship or at least punish certain sectors of our economy like the beef and wine industry.
Now, there's
that was what I was doing. I was trying to...
Sorry, as all this played out, there are a couple of billionaires in your state who played a prominent role, essentially asking Australia to go easy on these calls for an investigation. Twiggy Forrest, of course, primarily, but also backed up by Kerry Stokes in his own newspaper, The West Australian. Are you concerned about the lines that both those billionaires were running? Were they running a line that was pro-Beijing at Australia's expense?
Well, I think both those Australians have done immensely well with their business. For a lot of people, their story is it's outstanding. In fact, they've gone from very little to a lot. They're billionaires now, so no one's quibbling with their prowess as businessmen. But certainly, our role as parliamentarians and as a government is to protect the Australian interest, and that doesn't always intersect with our business interests. I'm also a competitive guy, as those men are themselves, and I want to be competitive for Australia. I want to see a competitive Australia. I don't want to see an Australia that gets pushed around by other countries. And so we've got to stand our ground. We've got to put out markers. We've got to show, what our limits are and protect our sovereignty. And so that's all the argument was last week.
But are Twiggy Forrest and Kerry Stokes being pushed around?
Well, I'm not saying, I'm actually not reflecting on them personally, but the business community has been very critical of politicians who've been upfront with China and some of the bad behaviour that we've witnessed. I mean, China has 1.4 billion people. My belief is that geography is destiny. China is not going anywhere, nor is Australia for that matter. So we're going to have to learn to live together. But part of having a healthy relationship is asserting your sovereignty, having boundaries, doing due diligence, calling out bad behaviour. And when we're being honest like that, that's when we can really start, working well together.
But let's just talk about our independent foreign policy. Everybody in this country understands we need an economic relationship with China, and everybody should understand we need to have our own strong foreign policy, though. And here's the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, in fact, quite a bit of support in a bipartisan sense in this country, saying we need an independent investigation into China to find the source of this global pandemic now. And Twiggy Forrest has gone out and argued against that. So we should delay it until it happens at a time that's politically convenient for Beijing.
Sure. And when you step out into the public square, whether you're an MP or a businessman or a reporter, whatever, you're going to cop criticism. And so, there was strong disagreement about his position.
What's your criticism? What's your criticism of what Twiggy Forrest had to say?
Well, my criticism is that we know it's a well-established fact that this pandemic started in China. And so we should be asking the Chinese government to cooperate with us on an independent inquiry, which is all that we've done. And pushing it off into the never-never or waiting until after the presidential election won't help or solve anything. We should do it now. That's the essence of the disagreement. And so when the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister and others have come out very strongly and asserted that position, I think it's beholden on all Australians, particularly in a week as fraught as last week was, to back in the government of the day.
Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. I appreciate it.